In the heart of Victorian society, towering asylums cast long shadows over the landscape. These institutions were built to house the mentally ill, the unwanted, and the forgotten. They promised care and rehabilitation, but behind their stone walls lay a terrifying reality, one of neglect, cruelty, and unspeakable suffering. Once you entered, your chances of leaving were slim. Many patients spent their entire lives trapped in a nightmarish existence. During the 19th century, mental illness was feared more than understood. Victorians believed that insanity was often inherited, a moral failing, or even a punishment from God. If a person behaved in a way that didn't fit society's rigid standards, they could be locked away indefinitely. Men could commit their wives for something as minor as arguing too much, reading novels excessively, or suffering from postpartum depression. Children with disabilities were abandoned in overcrowded wards. The poor, the homeless, and the unwanted elderly were sent to asylums simply because society had no place for them. Patients entered through heavy iron gates, greeted not by care but by chaos. Many were immediately stripped of their clothes and dignity. The most unmanageable were shackled to walls, placed in straitjackets, or locked in dark, windowless cells for days at a time. The birth of the asylum system before the rise of asylums, the mentally ill were either locked in prisons or kept at home under family supervision. In the early 1800s, reformers pushed for a more humane approach, leading to the construction of massive institutions designed to separate the mentally ill from the rest of society. One of the most infamous of these institutions was London's Bedlam Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam. By the time of the Victorian era, Bedlam had already gained a sinister reputation. The public could pay a fee to walk through its halls and gawk at patients, treating their suffering as entertainment. Asylums spread across England and the United States, often promoted as places of healing. In reality, most quickly became overcrowded, underfunded, and rife with abuse. Instead of treatment, patients were subjected to horrifying cures. Physicians experimented with barbaric procedures to cure mental illness. Ice water therapy submerged patients in freezing water for hours to shock them into sanity. Many suffered hypothermia or went into shock. Bloodletting and leeching were common practices where doctors drained blood from patients, believing it would release bad humors causing madness. Many weakened or died from excessive blood loss. Rotational therapy forced patients into chairs and spun them rapidly for extended periods, causing nausea, dizziness, and loss of consciousness. Lobotomies involved surgeons drilling holes into patients' skulls or severing parts of their brains in an effort to control violent or unpredictable behavior. Most patients were left with permanent brain damage or reduced to a vegetative state. Isolation and straitjackets kept patients locked away in padded cells, strapped to their beds, or placed in straitjackets for days at a time. Some were left in complete darkness for weeks, causing irreversible psychological trauma. Women were particularly vulnerable in asylums. The Victorian era's strict gender roles meant that any woman who defied expectations could be declared insane. Hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis for everything from anxiety to sexual desire. Women who were too outspoken, independent, or difficult were committed by their families, never to be seen again. The nightmare of overcrowding. By the mid-19th century, asylums were crammed far beyond their capacity. Institutions built for 500 patients often held thousands. Doctors and nurses were overwhelmed, unable to provide even the most basic care. Many patients were left to wander filthy corridors, covered in their own waste, malnourished, and neglected. Disease spread rapidly, and many died from tuberculosis, dysentery, or untreated infections. The dead were often buried in mass graves on asylum grounds, their names forgotten. Some asylums performed unmarked burials in the dead of night to avoid scrutiny. Even in death, these souls remained lost to history. The beginning of the end. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reports of asylum horrors began surfacing. Journalists and reformers exposed the inhumane conditions, forcing governments to reconsider how the mentally ill were treated. One of the most shocking accounts came from Nellie Bly, an investigative journalist who went undercover in the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York in 1887. What she uncovered was horrifying. Patients beaten, starved, forced to sit in freezing water baths for hours, and denied medical care. Bly's report led to public outrage and some reforms, but for many, the changes came too late. By the mid-20th century, many Victorian-era asylums were abandoned. Advances in psychiatric medication and changing attitudes toward mental health led to deinstitutionalization. Thousands of patients were released, though many had nowhere to go. The massive, decaying asylums were left to rot, their empty halls echoing with memories of suffering, ghostly legends, and the haunting legacy. Even today, some of these asylums stand in eerie silence. Places like Waverly Hills Sanatorium, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and the abandoned corridors of Bedlam are rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who suffered within their walls. Ghost hunters and urban explorers report hearing whispers, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The legacy of Victorian asylums is a grim reminder of how mental illness was misunderstood and mistreated. The people locked away, forgotten by society, were not monsters, but victims of a cruel and unfeeling system. Want to uncover more hidden horrors from history? Like and subscribe, if you dare.